In 1817, Thomas Jefferson, the former president of the United States and the man who literally wrote the Declaration of Independence, made a simple request. He wanted a copy of a book, not a rare manuscript from the libraries of Europe, but a pricing guide used by the Carpenters Company of Philadelphia. He was refused. The oldest craft guild in North America, founded in 1724, told the most powerful man in the country that their rulebook was for members only. Jefferson was an architect in his own right. He designed Monticello. He understood the physics of stone and timber better than almost any professional of his era. Yet he could not access this document. I spent weeks trying to understand why. What I found wasn't just about carpentry. It was about an entire economic system that existed before 1863. A system that didn't require a single bank to function. It was a world they had to make us forget. The Carpenters Company didn't just build houses, they built the foundation of the nation. When Philadelphia needed Independence Hall, they built it. When the colonies needed a secret meeting place for the First Continental Congress, the Guild offered their own hall. These buildings still stand today, not because of constant modern renovation, but because of a system of master builders that we no longer allow to exist. Their secret rulebook contained a pricing system based on unit pricing. Every stage of construction had a standardized, fair price determined by a team of experienced members called measurers. It wasn't about what the market would bear or how much a client could be squeezed for profit. It was a community-regulated system of equity. Neighbors helped neighbors. Credit was extended face-to-face, often held open for months or even years. Work was exchanged for food, for materials, or for other services. As the Bureau of Labor Statistics noted in a 1928 report, colonial America operated on a system of barter where scarce currency was rarely used to pay wages. This was an economy of mutual obligation. It bound people together through direct personal trust. But this autonomy posed a massive threat to the rising tide of centralization. If a community can regulate its own prices and build its own infrastructure without an external middleman, how does a government extract its share? How do you tax a handshake? How do you control a population that doesn't need your currency to survive? The official history tells us that by 1863, the system had become chaotic. They point to the more than 7,000 different state banknotes in circulation, a nightmare of counterfeit money and fluctuating values. They tell us that the National Currency Act was passed to bring stability to a broken nation. But when you look at the actual vote in the Senate, a margin of only 2 votes, you realize that half the country knew exactly what was being lost. The act didn't just create a uniform dollar, it created a trap. It required banks to buy federal debt to issue money, effectively turning every local lender into a branch of the central government. By 1865, a 10% tax was placed on all state and local currencies, effectively making the old world economy illegal overnight. But why the urgency? Why destroy a system that produced structures like Independence Hall in favor of one that required constant interest-bearing debt? The answer lies in a second law passed just 9 months earlier, a law that promised every American free land, but contained a hidden cost that would bankrupt a generation. It was the great democratic promise. But, as we are about to see, it was actually the bait for a trap that would turn independent artisans into lifelong borrowers. The official history books tell us that by 1863, the American economy was a disaster. They point to the wildcat banking era, where over 7,000 different state banknotes circulated. A $5 bill from New York might be worth only $3 by the time you crossed into New Jersey. Counterfeiters were so skilled that the Library of Congress documents upwards of 10,000 unique and legal banknotes in circulation, making it nearly impossible for the average citizen to know what was real. This is the chaos narrative, the justification for everything that came next. But here is the detail that the textbooks ignore. While the paper currency was in chaos, the physical world was in its prime. The buildings constructed under this primitive system still stand. The furniture made by craftsmen like the ones in the Philadelphia Guild still holds together without a single wobble or creak after nearly 2 centuries. If the economy was truly failing, how did it produce Independence Hall? How did it build Christ Church? The chaos wasn't in the craftsmanship or the community. It was in the centralized government's inability to track, tax, and control the face-to-face barter that defined American life. On February 25, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed the National Currency Act into law. It passed the Senate by a razor-thin margin of 23 to 21. This act created the office of the Comptroller of the Currency and established the first national banking system. We are taught this was a noble effort to bring uniform stability to a war-torn nation. But the Federal Reserve A.S. own historical archives state the purpose plainly. It was a military necessity to finance the Civil War. The government needed buyers for federal debt. Under the new law, national banks were required to buy Treasury securities equal to 1/3 of their capital. To issue more money, banks had to buy more government bonds. The entire banking system was redesigned not to serve the local carpenter or the farmer, but to turn them into indirect financiers of the federal government. By 1865, a 10% tax was placed on all state banknotes, effectively killing every local currency in America. The old world of mutual obligation was legally executed in favor of a centralized, interest-bearing debt machine. We are told this centralization was an evolution away from primitive inefficiency. But once the local currencies were dead, the government turned its attention to the most valuable asset any American could own: land. If you can control the land, you can control the people. And just 9 months before the Banking Act, they passed the Homestead Act of 1862. It offered 160 acres of public land to any adult citizen for a small filing fee of just $18. On the surface, it was the greatest democratic promise in human history: free land for the common man. But as we look closer at the numbers, a terrifying pattern emerges. Only 40% of the people who claim that land actually kept it. Most of it was snatched up by speculators, railroads, and mining companies. Why? Because the government gave the people land they couldn't afford to keep. To turn that free dirt into a functional farm, you needed tools, seed, and livestock, costs that historians estimate were between $1,000 and $2,500. The common laborer didn't have that kind of money in 1863. So where did they get it? The timing is too precise to be an accident. The government offered land that required a loan, and then created the national banks to provide that loan. It was a closed-loop system designed to turn independent pioneers into lifelong debtors. But the debt wasn't the final destination. The final destination was the company town, a system that would effectively bring back a new, digital form of slavery under the guise of industrial progress. The Homestead Act of 1862 is often painted as the ultimate gift to the American pioneer. For a mere $18 filing fee, any citizen could claim 160 acres of the vast open West. It was the great democratic promise. But there was a mathematical ghost in the machinery of this law. To actually turn that raw dirt into a functioning farm, a settler needed tools, seed, livestock, and lumber. Historians now estimate the real startup cost was between $1,000 and $2,500. In 1862, a common laborer earned less than $1 a day. The defreelated freeland was a biological and financial impossibility for the very people it was supposedly designed for. As the National Archives states plainly, comparatively few laborers could actually afford to build a farm. The result? Only 40% of homesteaders ever successfully completed their claims. The rest of that free land didn't go to families. It flowed directly into the hands of cattlemen, mining syndicates, and the railroads. The government had offered a prize that required a massive infusion of capital to win. And exactly 9 months later, the National Banking Act provided the solution: a centralized system of lenders. This was the birth of mass market debt in America. For the first time, the independent artisan was encouraged to stop relying on his neighbors and start relying on a bank. The face-to-face credit of the Philadelphia Guild was being replaced by a ledger in a skyscraper. But as the farmers and builders moved into this new system of borrowing, they encountered a new kind of territory: the company town. By the 1880s, approximately 2,000 of these model communities existed across America. In places like Lowell, Massachusetts, or the coal fields of West Virginia, the corporation owned everything. They owned your house, they owned the school, and most importantly, they owned the store. Workers in these towns were often paid not in federal dollars, but in script, a private currency issued by the employer that could only be spent at the company-owned store. Because there was no competition, the company could set the prices as high as they wanted. A gallon of milk or a bag of flour could cost 3 times its actual value. The Social Welfare History Project documents that workers quickly built up massive debts to their employers, debts they were legally required to pay off before they were allowed to leave. It was a closed-loop economy. The company paid you, then took the money back through inflated prices, and then charged you interest on the difference. By the time the Pullman strike of 1894 erupted, involving over 150,000 workers, the commission investigating the cause labeled the system un-American. But it was too late. The guild networks that regulated fair pricing and the barter systems that bound communities together had been dismantled. We look back at this as a period of industrial progress, but it was actually a period of identity extraction. Before 1863, you were a member of a guild with a secret rulebook for fair pricing. After 1863, you were a debtor in a company town. And to ensure no one could ever return to the old ways, the government began a systematic erasure of the records that prove those old ways ever worked. But how do you make a population forget that they once lived without banks? You don't just change the money, you change the history. And the most chilling evidence of this great erasure lies in the suspicious destruction of the 1890 census, a record of 62 million Americans that vanished just one day before it could have been saved by a fireproof vault. If the guild system was truly as primitive and inefficient as the textbooks claim, then it should have vanished naturally with the arrival of the modern bank. But it didn't. To truly erase the old economy, the government had to make it illegal. And the proof of this legal execution lies in the one group of Americans who fought to stay behind, the Amish. To this day, the Amish operate on a contribution-based economy that looks exactly like the Philadelphia guild system from 1817. They do not use commercial insurance. They do not take out bank loans for medical emergencies. When a member of their community faces a hospital bill of $100,000, they don't call an insurance adjuster. They stand up in their weekly church service and announce the need. No one leaves that room until the community has raised every single penny to cover the expense. It is a system of mutual obligation that functions perfectly without an external institution extracting a profit. But here's the chilling part. The United States government spent years trying to force them to stop. When Social Security was introduced, the Amish viewed it not as a tax, but as a form of commercial insurance, something their faith prohibits because it replaces the devoir, the duty of the neighbor, with the debt to the state. The IRS began seizing Amish horses and equipment to pay for a system they refused to benefit from. The Amish had to take their fight all the way to Congress. In 1965, they finally won a special exemption, but it came with a catch. To live like an American did before 1863, to function without banks and federal insurance, you must now file IRS Form 4029. It is an official application for exemption from the modern world. The very existence of this form proves that the old system works so well that the government had to create a specific legal waiver just to allow a tiny sliver of the population to keep practicing it. If it didn't work, the government wouldn't have to regulate it. They wouldn't have to make it a matter of religious exemption. They would just let it fail. But the Amish aren't failing. They are thriving, while the rest of the nation is drowning in over $17 trillion of household debt. The Amish still build barns that last a century using the same unit pricing. Logic Thomas Jefferson was denied. They are the living evidence that the Great Reset of 1863 was not an evolution. It was a hostile takeover of the American community. But why the 1960s? Why did the government finally grant this exemption just as the paper trail of the 19th century was being permanently erased? This brings us to the most disturbing pattern of all, the 1870 brick wall. If you try to trace your own family history, you will find that almost every American genealogical line hits a dead end in the exact same decade the banking system was consolidated. Before 1870, you were a member of a community, a guild, or a local network of trust. After 1870, you became an individual documented in a federal census, working for a wage and borrowing from a bank. You were no longer a master builder, you were a data point. And to ensure you could never look back and see who your ancestors really were, the government stood by and watched as the most important records in American history went up in flames, on the very eve of their preservation. If you have ever tried to trace your family tree, you have likely run headfirst into what genealogists call the 1870 brick wall. It is a phenomenon where records suddenly become thin, fragmented, or non-existent the moment you look back past the Reconstruction era. We are told this is a natural consequence of the Civil War's destruction. But when you align this wall with the National Banking Act of 1863 and the rise of the company town, a much more clinical pattern emerges. The government wasn't just centralizing the money, they were centralizing the identity of every living American. Before 1870, your identity was anchored in your community, your church, and your guild. You were a member of a local network of mutual obligation. But after 1870, you became an individual data point in a federal census, a wage earner in a national economy, and a debtor to a centralized bank. The bridge between the old world of master builders and the new world of employees was the 1890s. Census, the most detailed record of the American transition ever created. This census documented 62.9 million people. It recorded their Civil War service, their home ownership, their debt, and their original family origins. It was the definitive proof of who we were before the reset was finalized. And yet, if you go looking for those records today, you will find that nearly every single one of them has been systematically wiped from the face of the earth. The official story is a tragic accident, a fire in 1921 in the basement of the Commerce Department building. But the accident is where the story gets theatrical. For 12 long years after that fire, the water damage record sat in a warehouse. There was no attempt to restore them, no attempt to copy the legible pages. Then, in early 1933, a bureaucrat sent a list of useless documents to the Librarian of Congress. On that list was the 1890 census. Congress authorized the total destruction of these records on February 21st, 1933. Look at the date of the very next day. On February 22nd, President Herbert Hoover stood just blocks away and laid the cornerstone for the National Archives building. the first fireproof state-of-the-art facility designed specifically to protect America's records from fire and neglect. They ordered the destruction of the nation's most vital history one day before the building that would have saved it was officially started. The bridge to our past was burned, soaked, and then intentionally shredded. Why was the government so eager to dispose of the 62 million names that defined the transition generation? Perhaps because those records contained evidence of the guild systems that worked without banks. Perhaps they documented the true origins of the orphan train, children who were being relocated to break the human chain of memory. By deleting the 1890 census, they ensured that the 1870 brick wall would remain impenetrable for the average American family. We are left with the artifacts. We have the furniture that doesn't wobble, made by men who never signed a loan. We have the cathedrals built with unit pricing that stand for centuries, while modern bank finance structures require renovation in 30 years. We have the Amish, who still file Form 4029 to maintain the duty of the neighbor over the debt to the state. The standardization of 1863 wasn't progress. It was a replacement of a system that didn't need a middleman. The chaos of 7,000 currencies was a small price to pay for the independence of the American artisan. Today, we are told that we have evolved into a stable global economy. But as we sit in homes we don't own, surrounded by furniture designed to break, we have to ask, was the Forbidden Book of Philadelphia kept secret to protect the carpenters? Or was it kept secret to protect us from realizing how much we have truly lost?